Collaborate. I am Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and I have in studio with me once again today Ed Sealover of Denver Business Journal and Jeff Wasden, Colorado Business Roundtable president. I thank you guys
actually
for
in studio, Ed. It's good to see what you actually look like.
Yes, it's nice to know that sometimes
I recognize your voice, but
you actually put the Colorado in Colorado Business Roundtable.
Well played, Ed.
A little bit of a guilt trip there. That was
good.
Well worth it, actually. I have these guys joining me today, though, to do a little bit of an in-depth analysis. As our audience knows, we have started our series officially, Colorado Election Watch. That's hashtag CO Election Watch. If you have any questions for our candidates, check out our page as well on our radio page or on our cobrt.com/electionwatch. You can find more information there about each of our shows and when those are going to be airing. But we just had on with us our state treasurer candidates. We had Brian Watson and Dave Young, and that was Thursday and Friday of last week. So we probably should have done this before they came in, but I couldn't get you guys together in studio.
Oh.
That was mostly his fault.
Yeah. I'll take it. It's okay. I can own that.
So,
it's interesting, Alex, that you've talked about that. It's not only a great race, but, I think it's probably good for our listeners to take a step back and really talk about what got us to this point where we're at Election Watch. And really, Ed, you and I and Pete really sat down and had some conversations around the upcoming gubernatorial race, right? After two terms of Governor Hickenlooper, and knowing that is going to be a hotly contested seat here in the state of Colorado, and wanting to really explore the candidates from all sides. And we started, looking at the way we could do that to provide that educational component for the business leaders. As many people know, the Colorado Business Roundtable, we love to say we're about policies, not politics. But the education piece about who will be serving in this state in that capacity was so important to us, and started with that particular series. You did a great job. We had some very interesting interviews. I know you had a couple favorites. I won't pin you down unless you really want to go there, but some things we could chuckle with off air and talk about, and once we kick the candidate out, we could laugh and talk about too.
But also some good in-depth conversations. I mean, we were able to bring out some topics that became vital issues in the race that I don't know would have floated to the surface otherwise. I mean, it was really, to forget on our program that Victor Mitchell, for the first time, made the comment, I wouldn't give a dime to Amazon, which kind of thrust both Amazon and economic development into the governor's race at that point. And we were able to talk not just in sound bites, but really, how do you fund transportation? How do you get the pipeline between schools and employers going? And for people, hopefully, who got to listen in, it made a difference in thinking of how they were going to vote.
Energy issues, rural broadband, healthcare. And one thing that I know you were so good about during that series, right? How are we going to fund it, right? That sounds like a great soundbite in a campaign speech, but let's get into specifics and let's really drill down into what that looks like. And then you followed up, obviously, with print articles. So it was a great combination. We were able to do that and provide that service. We moved into the gubernatorial forums that we hosted, that you had your first foray into moderating gubernatorial race. You've done this, of course, several other races across the state and even in statewide races, and it was fun for you to be able to jump in there and share a little bit about your thoughts. So talk about those two forums and what that looked like from your perspective, moderating your first gubernatorial debates.
It was really interesting, the fact that we got 4 candidates each up on stage in the Democratic and the Republican forums. And it was good because we really got them talking at length about some things that other forums go quickly through. And that's not a criticism of other forums, other debates. I mean, you work with the time you have to get to.
Better. Well, I love that about
Well,
that.
I mean, our focus is more narrow. We didn't have to ask them about guns. We didn't have to ask them about social issues. And in fact, I think in our forums, we generally kept them away from attacking each other because we just really beat down on the specifics. And again, forums where I think people got to learn a lot about the candidates, and where I think in some ways the candidates got to learn about themselves. I didn't see the Jared Polis push push for single-payer health care as an issue until he came to our forum and almost seemed to test it out a little bit, because it was an area where he stood out from the other three candidates, and he ran with it after that. In fact, in his PR materials, he put it out as, "Hey, did you see this forum? This is what I talked about." So the chance, I mean, that's what this show should be about, is what we do should really be about. It's a chance to dig down into these things in an almost geeky way, but in a way that if you really want to know where someone's going to stand on an issue, you're going to find out from talking to us.
Well, that's exactly right. Right from the business community, the understanding of how legislation can impact and their ability to be successful, right? And when you start talking about workforce, labor laws, regulation, taxing, and you go down those limits, you want to know where these candidates stand on that and how it's going to impact you and your state and your industry, your sector moving forward. And such a great opportunity. And so we ran through that. We finished the forums. We finished our last, Finding Colorado's Next Governor series, and then kind of went.
Until May.
Yes, yeah. When we had one of the two candidates who ended up being their party's nominees, Jared Polis, being the last one on.
Very last one in May.
We circled back and got everybody we needed in front of the public eye there.
Hit all the key candidates, finished right before, obviously, the primaries and the assemblies that went on. It was great. I think everybody appreciated that. We had a chance to talk a little bit, not necessarily with this series, but certainly as a lead into even with the state party officials, both Morgan Carroll on the D side, Jeff Hayes on the Republican side, to really paint that picture, get the idea of what they were expecting. Talked to Morgan Carroll. I remember specifically that historically the Republicans have fielded large competitive primaries that has sometimes gotten nasty, and the Ds have kind of had to lay in wait and get the sound bites and not have to fundraise. This year, Shoe shifted, definitely.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's and across the fact that in many ways the Republicans and D shifted places, both at very competitive gubernatorial primaries as well as very competitive treasurer primaries. But it was the Ds who took it upon themselves to have a competitive attorney general primary where the Republicans just handpicked their candidate, which is something you almost never see in the Republican Party. Right?
Yeah, it's interesting. And so the idea of what do we do next, right? Here we've got this amazing candidate pool, this great opportunity for us to build on that series. And the idea for Colorado election 2018 came out. And I think Ed, you deserve a little credit about that, because you see this in the response from the business community, your work to what's happening on air, to what's happening in print, and the value that I think that business owners see in hearing, to your point, some specifics, right? Getting away from the sound bites. We can all hear them. They're great. Every candidate is very good at delivering that stump speech, but getting more into depth in the details about why this matters. What is your priority? What does it look like if you're going to be elected governor, or secretary of state, or treasurer, or AG? How does your office function? And really, I think, bring that to the forefront so people can make informed decisions, which is really what we're all about here.
And sometimes it's not just getting away from the sound bites, it's the chance to even put these issues out there. I mean, if we didn't do a gubernatorial Colorado Election Watch edition, people would still be able to find out about Walker Stapleton and about Jared Polis. If you two are listening, that doesn't mean you don't come on the show. I'm just saying. But if we didn't do a treasurer's edition, or if we didn't do a business-focused Secretary of State edition, I think it would be a different world. I mean, there's not a lot of places to learn about that. And I mentioned this on another radio show that Colorado Business Roundtable sponsors. My editor was actually shocked that one of the most read articles we had leading into the election was my story on Dave Young versus Bernard Dowett in the Democratic Treasurer's primary. She's like, I don't think anybody would want to read about that. But then I went online and realized that pretty much nobody else had written about that. That's why people got into it. And when we have the opportunity here to be that reservoir of knowledge where people can go for at least surface level and hopefully deeper introductions to what the candidates stand for, I think we serve a purpose well beyond letting candidates yak for 49 minutes.
Absolutely. And one of my favorite parts, I have to say, about the series that I've been through with you guys, and moving forward, I hope to see more of this too, but you don't let them get away without answering a question, right? There are a lot of times that we know that politicians talk in circles. It happens. It's going to happen. An hour-long show, it might happen more, right? But you guys are both very good about honing in on the answer that you're trying to get from the candidates that we've had come through the door.
It's a little Texas two-step going on sometimes. little taps, yeah. But I think that's really what Ed, right? Because in the understanding, right, in your background and being able to go, hey, that's great, but I need some specifics, some details. If I'm going to be writing a story about it, if I'm going to be casting my ballot, I need to understand actually what that means, right? It's great to say I'm not going to pay for transportation out of general fund. We need a new revenue stream. Well, what is that revenue stream? Where does that come from? And then what is the impact not only upon the general fund, but the other areas of the budget? And I think that whole series we were able to do that. What does energy policy look like? What does that mean? And not just ask them and let them get away with an answer, but coming back and asking some really clarifying questions to draw out that detail and make them actually articulate that position, because I think that's what the voters and listeners are asking for.
I certainly hope it is, and I mean, it's sometimes easier too to bear down on them. Exactly how are you going to pay for that? Exactly what does it mean you're going to set up a public bank, rather than tell me again you don't have 3 illegitimate children across the ass. I mean, when you can go after them on their own issues rather than on something personal or dirty political, I think maybe in some ways they want to talk more. Maybe it's kind of a relief that they actually get to talk about this, even if they have to go to more in depth than they might be comfortable with.
Yeah. Well, it's great. So you teased up the bank in our state treasurer's race, which was our first of our Colorado election watch 2018, our series that we did there with Representative Dave Young and Brian Watson. I found that fascinating, right, again, because we were able to get into those kind of specific areas. I think everybody knew we were going to ask about para, the governance structure, the background questions, but to start really talk about on your website, you list this. Let's drill into actually what that looks like and what that means. And I think, again, refreshing, very educational to those that were here that had an opportunity to see and hear that, but even more importantly, I found it very educational, even on my end, to start to understand where they were getting that information, where that idea came from, what they thought it might look like, how they could bring something like that to our state and take a look at that, whether it's a pilot system, whether it's testing it. It may find, that ultimately the voters do not align with that particular view, that is either too extreme for Colorado. It doesn't fit with our values, our systems, or maybe that we think we might be able to learn from others and, look at best practices that came from other states and not try and reinvent the wheel every time.
Yeah, the important point, though, is that people are going to be talking about that. I mean, the treasurer's race is actually a great example, too, of when it's actually very important to talk about somebody's background. You have 2 very different candidates here. One is essentially an investment real estate entrepreneur. The other is a longtime teacher who has served on the Joint Budget Committee, one of the 6 people that puts together the state's $30 billion budget. And these are wildly different angles that people can come from being the treasurer. And I don't think people are going to hear that enough. I think it's going to get drowned out in a lot of what goes on this session. So hopefully people can say, oh, wait, what do they want to do in this job? I mean, ideally, that's what you want for all the down-ballot races. I think too often the idea of the down-ballot races is who did I vote for in the primary or in the governor's race, and I'll just check that party's box going down. And I want people to rethink that. I mean, maybe a Republican has a good idea in one of these races, a Democrat's got a good idea in another. You should really think about what these offices mean, because as we point out with the treasurer's race, every treasurer since 1987 has gone on to run for higher office in the state of Colorado, for another statewide office. And so if you don't think it's important who you're voting for in this race, then just wait 4 years, because one of them may be running for governor.
That was a great fact, and I loved hearing that, because I think intuitively we know that, but to actually put that down there and start to think
and I should give full credit to Dick Wadhams on that one. He and I were talking, and I said, this is the way it happens, right? And he's the one who went through and said, oh, yes, you go back to this specific year, and that's where you get it from.
For treasurer. It's been fascinating, right? Because certainly at least in one of those 2 candidates, that rumor is certainly out there, right, that Brian is looking at this potentially as a stepping stone. And so to be able to have that information to actually ask him and say, this is what historically this office. But again, the background, and I think, Ed, what you pointed out, right, the noise from the governor's race is going to be overwhelming. This is going to be a hotly contested seat, and there's going to be a lot of fun spent not only by the candidates, but certainly by third party, by these independent expenditure committees. It will matter. The resources will be unlimited. and it will drown out, I think, some of these down-taker races. So for our ability to sit and highlight Secretary of State, the AG's race, the state treasurer's race, that are critically important to the functions of Colorado and our government, and certainly to the lives of those that get impacted by those offices, it does matter. And so people will have a resource to be able to say, hey, I'm assuming Dave Young and Brian Watson are going to put out stuff that's favorable to them. Where do I actually get the information, the facts, and be able to compare the two? And I think that's really what we were able to do in that first set of interviews on the state treasurer's race last week.
Yes, and I apologize. I just realized it's 1977, not 1987, that every treasurer has run for this top office. Anyway, but yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, and hopefully we're going to find that as we go ahead here. I don't think there's going to be a shortage of people needing information on the AG's race. I think the fact that, one, you have a very high-profile candidate in George Brockler, and the other, Phil Weiser, the Democratic nominee, has just been through a very competitive Democratic primary. I think that has people paying a little bit more attention. But I love the idea that while they're going to be talking about their prosecutorial backgrounds or lack thereof, they're going to be talking about their work with the Obama administration or lack thereof, we will be able to ask them a little bit about financial crimes. We'll be able to ask them, I know one of the candidates wants to be a national leader in restoring net neutrality. We'll be able to talk about that issue with the candidates where that's not necessarily going to float to the top, and we'll be able to understand, down to the level of what will you do in regard to oil and gas, and where do you stand with the Martinez case, the case that says that the lower court ruled the state has to prioritize public safety over everything else when it comes to choosing oil and gas permits. Where do these candidates stand? We'll be able to get that conversation out there.
4 statewide races: treasurer, secretary of state, AG, and governor. We have 8 candidates. What was the surprise coming out of the primary for you about who we're going to be interviewing that survived that, and who you thought may be there that didn't make it through?
I guess maybe none of them was an overwhelming surprise. I still say the biggest surprise was the margin by which Jared Polis won the Democratic primary. I think if any of the 8 that I wouldn't have put on our schedule if we were planning this in February or March, it would have been Brian Watson. Watson, certainly sort of a known name. I wrote about him back in 2012 when he ran for a critical swing seat in the State House, but unless you live in the Cherry Hills, Greenwood Village area, you probably didn't know Brian's name. But he put a lot of his own resources into it and was able to push over, get over, I should say, Justin Everett by only 1 percentage point. Everett, not what you would consider a mainstream Republican. He's certainly known by many to be the most conservative member of the State House, but he had the backing of the
Dr. No.
Yeah, the Ken Bucks of the world. The folks who are very well known names in Republican politics, and even with a much smaller budget, I thought that was going to be able to get him through, especially in a primary where people typically swerve right. To see Brian get his message out meant that he really resounded with a number of voters in that race.
It's interesting. I think Brian did a lot of preparatory work for this race, right? He's been very good about these community barbecues, the Opportunity Coalition, and trying to build that network. As you mentioned, he barely got past Justin, a very close race. I was a little surprised in that one because I thought Polly would be a more formidable opponent. And to me and several others, I think she was maybe a slight favorite in that particular race, with Brian coming in third and her and Justin fighting that as 2 state reps down at the Capitol coming out of that. So it was very interesting to see that thing flip, and congrats obviously to Brian for winning that, and had a great interview with him. But that is certainly one of the 2 that was probably a little more surprised.
Yeah, what else surprised you?
I think the other one, was the Weiser Salazar race coming out of the AG on the D side, right? And I think there was a little bit more. I think watching the ads and stuff start to come out where, Phil was trying to say it's not that Salazar. He's not related to that Salazar. Don't let the name fool you, people, which was quite entertaining to kind of watch. And his understanding that, oh, my goodness, name ID does matter in this state and these races. And right now, Joe Salazar has a name ID, and if I don't do some things, and so he really had to double down at the last minute, right? He put a pretty strong 11th hour pitch in there to really get some ad buys to try and up his name profile. Clearly was just enough to get by.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought that was a real bellwether race in some ways, too, on exactly where Democratic voters were going to go this time around. I mean, Joe Salazar, there was no candidate in the state of Colorado who's been linked more to Bernie Sanders than Joe Salazar. He was the first big outspoken backer of Sanders during the 2016 campaign, among elected officials at least. He really spoke for a kind of progressive, very liberal message that where he sometimes tosses the mainstream of the party right overboard and says, you're doing this wrong. You're not thinking about people enough. Weiser was, your classic, even if you didn't have the name recognition, your classic kind of party insider guy, literally worked for Barack Obama, has been a part of major economic development plays in this state, has kind of been the inside guy without his name being out there. And had Salazar won this race, I would say that would have really opened up some huge questions about where the state was going in the general election. I think, a Weiser-Brockler race is more, the party's two anointed candidates going after each other. So I don't know what that necessarily tells us about November, but that was interesting to see. More than any of the other statewide races, two factions of one party clashing against each other.
The other thing, and it's clear in those contrasts, right, that you've got some folks that came out of the primary that I think the opponent was probably hoping another candidate emerged, right? If you're George Brockler, you probably wanted to run against Salazar because of the contrast and certainly his views on oil, gas, and some other areas. I think if you're Stapleton, you probably got what you wanted, right?
Well, Walker Stapleton has been running against Jared Polis since he announced he was getting in this race. And while I think that is part pragmatism, that he really did think Polis was going to win this, I think it was also part hope. I mean, Polis was the farthest left of the four candidates. Now, that's not saying Walker wasn't the farthest right of the four Republican candidates come out here. I would probably put George Lopez a little farther on the spectrum there. But this is what Walker wanted. He wanted somebody who kind of made the middle in play, whereas, running against, say, a Michael Johnson would have made that middle a lot more leaning toward the Democratic candidates.
Well, let's talk about that middle and in play, right? This is the first year, obviously, that we had a very different landscape in our primary season, thanks to 107, 108, right, in the process of allowing our independent, unaffiliated voters the right to engage. Talk about, from your view, Ed, impacts, what you thought that may or may not have meant. To me, it may have been a little too new, probably a little more negligible impact. I think where you're going to see maybe some gaming is where you maybe have an incumbent who's safe that may dabble a little bit in saying, but I don't think of Jared Polis, for example, when Kerry Kennedy and Mike Johnson were making a late push, and with Donna Lynn being such a strong candidate, could play with that primary and not attract every voter that they could, right? You couldn't go game up another one for fear that it may turn around and cost you at the end of the day.
Right, and I don't think the middle made a huge difference in this. For one, I think it's such a new thing that I don't think a lot of unaffiliated voters got into it. And clearly, there were some that were voting, obviously. But I think people would have told you they would have liked to see a little bit more of that. The other thing that I think was really interesting, I think unaffiliated voters gravitated toward Democratic primaries this time around because there were a lot more competitive down-ballot Democratic races in state house districts, in state Senate districts in particular. And while Democrats are very excited coming out of the primary saying a lot more people wanted to vote Democrat, I think they're missing that a lot of unaffiliates probably went that way. And also because the media had essentially, for better or for worse, declared the Republican governor's race over as soon as George Brockler dropped out of it. And I think everybody, even though Polis won by a bigger margin than Stapleton did, I think everyone thought that was going to be a closer race, and that's where their vote might count.
Yeah, and certainly Walker, I think, was able to emerge as the Republican Party candidate without spending a lot of resources, knowing he had that comfortable margin. And I know Vic Mitchell obviously put in significant resources, including an extra $1 million at the end to try and, again, up his ID and to try and influence the outcome of that election. I think you're rightly so, Ed, in looking at how that impact was negligible, but certainly more to the point where they had a lot more say in the local communities and their neighborhoods to try and go and impact their candidate for a state house, state senate race versus worrying about the governor's race.
Stay with us here on Connect and Collaborate. We'll be right back with this in-depth analysis on the Colorado Election Watch. We'll be right back on cobrt.com/live. Stay with us. Welcome back to Connect and Collaborate. Once again, I am Alex Hopkins, your on-air producer, and we are talking in-depth analysis of Colorado Election Watch here with Jeff Wasden and Ed Sealover. You guys are doing a great job at analyzing what we've got going on. The previous, we talked about our previous series, Finding Colorado's Next Governor, which was pretty eye-opening for me. I would go back and watch those before we got to the primaries, and I was like, okay. All right, I know where I'm going. But as an unaffiliated voter, as we were talking about before the break, I didn't get any literature from anybody. So that was really sad. I should let our candidates know that I didn't get anything.
I thought you'd be hit up
don't
twice.
Don't worry, because they're going to make up for it come this election. Okay. Everyone will be reaching out to you now.
All right.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Good to know.
Old school campaign philosophy. We were chatting a little bit about that. It's trying to target those most likely to vote, right? The primary numbers are always down, and so you're trying to, with limited resources, knowing that you may emerge. You've got a general election coming. You've got to have money in the war chest to be able to compete. And I think, this was a new landscape for Colorado. And I think people are trying to fill that out. I think things will change. But Ed, you are spot on that now that we have general insights 100 days away and coming quick, you're going to get hit a lot.
Yeah, you will. And hopefully I'm actually not being too optimistic, because that is the thing about off-year elections, non-presidential elections, is that there is more work to get the base of each party out than there is to get the middle out. So, but I think in this state especially, as we continue to see lower and lower percentages of people registering with the parties and more people registering as unaffiliated, I don't think any campaign can ignore the unaffiliated this time around, especially when you look at this foursome of races, there's not a one of them that people are assuming has a heavy favorite. I mean, everyone's going to need every vote to get out.
Well, the other thing, too, is we kind of look at the candidates, and certainly you talked a little bit about the background from the state treasurer's race. You've got Dave Young, a state representative on the Joint Budget Committee, the JBC, and his background as an educator, and certainly Brian Watson and where he comes. Shifting to the Secretary of State's race, you've got two very different candidates again, but also the only race that neither of them had that competitive primary. We talked about the governor's race with the candidates and, the Weiser-Salazar battles and Brian Watson, Justin Everett, Polly Lawrence. Here we come to the Secretary of State. You've got an incumbent, Wayne Williams, and you've got Jenna Griswold, a newcomer with no primary. Jenna's case certainly is not battle tested, so it's going to be very interesting to see how she competes in that Secretary of State's race.
Yeah, and a lot of people say the treasurer's race is that under-the-radar race, but again, because of the history of the treasurer, it's usually viewed as the stepping stone up. The Secretary of State, you've never seen a Secretary of State, at least not in any recent memory, go on to run or to be a party's nominee for governor. Yeah. I was a little bit overstepping Scott Gessler there for a second, but it's
how soon will you forget? Sorry, Scott.
So it's a more under the radar race, and it's more of a very technical race. So it'll be interesting to see how this one goes in particular. I think Wayne Williams is going to run out, and his not running in a primary, and I don't think anybody expected you're going to get primaried as an incumbent in a statewide office, but his not running in a primary really allows him to go straight to the middle in this race. And he's a guy who is already putting out press release after press release of national accolades by this nonpartisan group, defending against intrusive Russian bots and running an election system. What did I just get from his office 2 weeks ago? Press release about how he just got put on a national panel of secretaries of state, but he was nominated by a Democratic Secretary of State for that. I mean, yeah, I think you're going to see that stuff mentioned more in his race than the fact that he's actually a Republican.
Is the only thing that matters in that race is who's going to stand up to Russia better than the opponent?
No, absolutely not. Now there may be some people who think that, and certainly for Jenna Griswold, it is a lot about who will stand up to Donald Trump. She is a lot of her mailings are still extremely angry that Williams agreed to turn over voter registrations when Trump formed that commission, saying, "Hey, we're going to look into see if there is voter fraud out there." She has been running on that since she got into the race. In fact, I think that's why she said she got into the race. But there's a lot more in that race. I mean, this is also the office that oversees all business registration. And as much as Williams can point to, hey, we've done this with voter safety, a number of past secretaries of state, and including and up to Williams, can point to, hey, we've done this to make it easier for businesses to register.
Scott Kessler certainly laid that groundwork, as you mentioned, Scott, in the governor's race,
really,
right?
Scott had a tremendous focus on that. That didn't get him out of the Republican gubernatorial primary in 2014. But I mean, that's a big issue for business. I think for entrepreneurs who may be looking at this too. I mean, there's nothing that's more costly and time-consuming than the licensing and the things you have to do to start a business. If you got a Secretary of State candidate talking your language about something that matters, that should help you vote in that race.
You know, as you start to look then at the big race, Polis v. Stapleton coming up, both of them came out of some competitive primaries, and again, I think we both agree the margins were surprising. I think most people thought that Kerry Kennedy, and coming out of her party's assembly, certainly a lot of the polling that was out there showed that was within the margins. I think there was a conversation that, or thought that, you know, Mike Johnson was really making a late push in that race and was starting to close ground, and Bloomberg had came in and it created a little buzz. I think that the people that were most excited about the candidate were really the Mike Johnson's fans, and they had a very fervent group of supporters that were out working with him. There was no doubt, you know, Donna Lynn was out there trying to kind of find her lane as a candidate and separate herself from Hickenlooper, that it wasn't a third term of Hickenlooper. But Polis certainly came out with a surprising margin. Then you move over to the Republican side with Stapleton, which I think, you know, had a little bit of the signature, you know, fiasco that kind of caught him. The team mobilized very quickly. They went through the assembly, which they were not planning on doing, came out with a strong assembly. I think he probably would have been a little bit unscathed. And as I've mentioned repeatedly, I think, you know, Lopez really owed Cynthia Kaufman a bottle of wine and a thank you card for having such a poor, you know, assembly performance that allowed Lopez to come up with a 31% to get out of that, because he had no ability to collect signatures and hadn't been engaged in that. Doug, I think, and I will still say, is probably the nicest guy in the state of Colorado, and I put him even ahead of me, which I know may shock two people, maybe. Maybe not. You know, and Vic coming in there with unlimited resources. But I think everybody expected this to be a Stapleton versus Polis gubernatorial battle.
Yeah, and I think there was a point there when Kerry Kennedy came out of the Democratic Assembly. She came out 61% to Polis.
She had a buzz.
32%, I believe it was.
Yeah.
I mean, she nearly doubled them up. And people looked at that and said, this is it. She may not only win this, she could be the favorite going in, and I think it showed that Polis's resources still trump everything, and I say that not in the, you know, people will say I was trying to buy the race, but the fact is he can put 20 pieces of mail in front of your face right away. He can get on that TV show, whether you're watching sports or news or the Life Channel,
the cooking show.
Yeah, I mean, he'll get on there and be in your face, and for better or worse, you're going to know who Jared Polis is when you walk into there, and there still may not have been people who knew who Kerry Kennedy was, who Mike Johnston was, and so now the trick is now Polis faces the Republican who's got deep pockets too, not self-deep pockets like Polis has, but has the network of pretty much seemingly every CEO with deep pockets in the state seems to be sitting on Stapleton's finance committee. And the Republican Governors Association has come out already with an ad. I mean, they clearly see this as one of their top pickup opportunities in the country, and they're going to put a lot of resources into it. So Stapleton isn't going to be able to out-publicize his candidates this time around. So that's why I think you're going to see this one getting uglier and muckier real quick. I think both of them are going to go, and you're already seeing that, go after each other's character. And I've said this before, I'm going to say it again, they don't need to, because this is an election about issues. This is an election where you cannot pick two candidates who have more divergent views on most issues, and you should be able to lay them out. I'm Jared Polis. I believe this, and here's what Stapleton believes. I'm Mark Stapleton. I believe this. Here's what Polis believes. And you should have people being able to decide right there and then. Energy, education, how to get your funding for transportation, and where that money's going.
Healthcare,
Healthcare,
immigration, sanctuary city, go down the line.
Exactly. exactly. There's almost nothing these two will agree upon, and I think that's.
Well,
in
that
some
compare
ways
and contrast piece, as you said, right?
Yeah.
Lay the issues out without the mudsling and let people make an informed vote, right? And who and where these candidates are, because they are going to be very clear. It's such an interesting race, and you talked about resource. I know there was a poll that came out pretty quickly after primary night that showed, Jared having about a 6-point lead. I think if I remember.
I think it was about an 8-point lead.
Was it 8 point?
And generally,
yeah.
That early on, 4 to 5 is margin of error. So,
yeah.
I mean, it's almost a toss-up. Jared's got a slight advantage.
I think there were people that were a little surprised that don't understand exactly what you just said, right? The inner workings and why that matters. But I think when you start to look at how Jared came out of the primary and the amount of TV ads and buys, right, it was to be expected. There was no doubt he was going to be the favorite.
Certainly would have had more name recognition than Walker.
Walker didn't need to do that to come out of the primary on the Republican side, and I think that's part of that ability to to sit back now and give Jared that slight advantage, right, on his end, to be able to say he's got that lead coming out, and how do you build upon that and how do you campaign. Certainly Congress is in recess. There are some that think they've been in recess all year, but now they're at least back in the district and able.
Just 1 year.
Yes. It'd be PC, but he's going to be in the district for the month of August now, and that time that he can now devote to that, where I think the ability to campaign from D.C. for governor gets a little bit harder from him personally. That doesn't mean his team and volunteers and the TV ads won't continue to run and Mel won't continue to drop. But how he uses his time now that he's back out from D.C. and on recess there will certainly matter to him in his campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good to see. I saw Stapleton put out a press release today saying that he's agreed to 9 debates. I haven't seen one from Polis. I assume that you generally put that out once your opponent is in on most of those, or in on at least the majority of those. So, I mean, the idea that we won't be able to contrast and compare them is I think out the window now. I think people will be able to see them. And I still think there are going to be people that are more toward the middle that are going to be wringing their hands on some issues. But I think there is something to like in one of these two candidates' platforms for everybody. It's not like, I think Jared is known for going very far left on energy and on healthcare issues. Walker's known for going very far right on immigration and tax issues. But there's areas where they converge. In fact, I was just talking to our state's economic development director for a profile I'm doing in next week's paper, and said, you might be the only person who could get her job back, regardless of who wins, because there's a little bit of similarity in their economic development platforms. But I think it's going to be harder to find that similarity. It's going to be easier to find those differences.
No doubt. Well, I think one thing that before we move on, I certainly want to spend a couple minutes talking about either other ballot initiatives. There's certainly some signature collection going on right now. Education.
Signature finding.
Well, sure.
Where's Waldo of your signatures?
Evidently, if you go to Greyhound, the bus terminal, you might never know what you may find there. Oh, what are these things doing back behind that
Anita Feller, she lives
dumpster? Kind of a little crazy, but education has certainly got theirs in already, and their initiative. You're certainly hearing about 97, some other takings initiatives on oil, gas. There will be others. Certainly, there's going to be some very important state house, state senate races. But I do want to talk a little bit about the national narrative, the Trump factor in an off-year election. There's certainly a referendum that appears to have reared its head with the exception maybe of Reagan and I think maybe Bush because of 9/11. Outside of that, it's really kind of a indictment on the party in power. What does that play? What does that look like here in the state of Colorado? And what does the Trump narrative do to a Stapleton versus Polis and on down the line?
Yeah, and and just for people who might say, oh, you guys are just bashing Trump. This is actually just a political fact that the party in power in Washington has a tough time holding on to seats in the next election. People who have gone out to vote for them, maybe sometimes reluctantly, will say, oh, but they didn't do everything I wanted. Now I want to bring the the sectors of government back to the other side, or I want to balance out our state with what's going on in Washington. Trump is going into this election with some pretty historically low numbers after 2 years. I don't think people can deny that. He's got fervent support, but he's got some pretty historically low numbers. And we're already talking about a state where he lost by 5 points in the general election. He was elected president. It wasn't because of Colorado. So you're going to see the anti-Trump narrative coming out of Democrats heavily. I think in Republicans and swing districts, you're not going to see as much of a pro-Trump narrative. See Kaufman, Mike. See how much he talks about loving Trump, which is 0% of the time. And I think that you have to expect this is a year when the Democrats can make gains. This is a year when they could do better in some seats than they otherwise would have. But I always throw this caveat in. Nobody saw 2016 coming either. And so you don't know. A lot of the Trump fans don't comment on public polls. There may be more support out there than we've seen. And don't forget, this is a guy who took deep blue Pueblo County in the 2016 election. So where is the industrial workforce? Now that Trump is slapping tariffs on Chinese goods, do people in places like Pueblo or other manufacturing areas suddenly lean more Republican than they normally would? Because while Republicans are wringing their hands and gnashing their teeth about some of these things, this actually goes more toward the Democratic side. I'll just say one thing. On my trip out here the last time around, I was driving beside a car that had 2 bumper stickers. One of them said, "I'm Teamster and I vote," and above it said Trump Pence. 4 years ago, I would have never believed that car would have existed, but that's the way people are thinking now. So it's who knows exactly what's out there, but it's got to be Democratic leaning to start based on political history.
You mentioned Kaufman. Is that really the only competitive race within our congressional delegation?
The Democrats say they are going to make a push again for Scott Tipton's seat. I don't know. I haven't seen evidence from past elections that their spending is paid off. Though I will say this, Tipton's margins have been no bigger than Mike Kaufman's margins, yet the Democrats are going to keep throwing money against Mike Kaufman every year because they put it in their top 10 races in the country. I think especially...
I don't think Scott's complaining.
And here's
I think he's okay with that.
And why he's okay with that is this, that if that Kaufman race is close, if the gubernatorial race is close, I think you'll see people pull away from some of these other races. And the 3rd CD is probably going to be one of those that Democrats will hang on as long as they don't think there's a better place that they have to invest their money. And if they see there's 4 or 5 other races that need it more, Diane Mitch Bush may not get the help she thinks she's going to get from the National Front on that one. But really, the Kaufman race is the one to watch. Along with, and maybe you were going there, but I'm going to jump in there anyway and say the state Senate. The state Senate is the one that is going to fly under some people's radar, but that is almost as important as the governor's race this year.
Is it 3 seats, Ed? I mean, is that what everybody says? 3 seats are going to control the state Senate?
I was talking to somebody the other day who was polling on a 4th seat, a seat in southwestern Jefferson County that Brittany Patterson is looking to run for, or she's running for. But not a lot of people seem to think that's going to be a seat that comes down to it. So yes, generally there are 3 seats we're talking about here that are going to, 2 are now Republican held, 1 is was Democratic held. Let me just go in and explain these. The 3 seats we're looking at here. The seat belonging to Republican Tim Neville.
In Jefferson County.
Northwestern Jefferson County actually goes into Clear Creek County, Gilpin County, even a little bit of Boulder County. Tim is a very conservative Republican. He is running in a swing district. He won 4 years ago because he ran against a very liberal Democrat. He's also a very hard worker. He's running against Tammy Story, who I believe is a first-time candidate. Sorry, Tammy, if I've got that background wrong. So it's going to be a very tight race, but that's going to be one of the 3 that's at it. In Adams County, Senator Beth Martinez-Humenic's seat in kind of the Thornton/Westminster area. Martinez-Humenic was the one that swung the state Senate 4 years ago from Democrat to Republican by winning a race that not a ton of people thought she was going to win. If she can hold that seat, that gives Republicans a much better chance. They've got to win Democrats have to win 2 out of 3 of these seats in order to take this. She's running against Representative Faith Winter, a 4-year House member, rising star in the House. Faith is a very hard worker. She's someone who had a political action committee that donated to candidates before she got elected. During her first race, she put one of those out there. So she's always had eyes on leadership, and she's a strong campaigner. I think a lot of eyes are going to be on that seat. In fact, I've seen some people who have said that is the #1 state house seat in America, state legislative seat that people will be watching. I think you're seeing an inordinate amount of money dropped into that one.
Wow.
The third seat, that's a very interesting one, is a seat that was held by a Democrat, Sherry John, state senator, who decided to go unaffiliated just before the start of the 2018 session. So technically, it's really still a Democratic seat. State Representative Jesse Danielson is running for the Democratic side. Sherry John is as middle of the road as you can get. That's why she went unaffiliated. Jesse Danielson, far more left side of the road. She's running against Republican businesswoman Christine Jensen, far more right side of the road. This is very mirroring of our gubernatorial race. It's two people that don't cross over a lot. But those are the three seats, and that, I should say, is in the Wheat Ridge, Lakewood area, that are really going to determine the state Senate. And the reason why this is so important, Republicans hold a 1-vote edge in the state Senate, 18-17. They've held that for 4 years, and that's the one vote that has stopped the Democrats from having complete control of the state government, which, some people would say that's been terrible because we haven't been able to push these things through. I think Governor Hickenlooper probably privately would tell you that's been great. That's a lot more things I don't have to worry about, whether or not I veto, because they get through one house and they die in the other.
Yeah. The veto pins get a lot more dust on them with this split legislature. There's no doubt.
Yes.
I think Colorado served better with that split legislature because they have the stopgap, right? Because Kevin Grantham and Chris Olbert and others there were able to put forth some different legislation. If the idea didn't muster bipartisan support to get to the governor's desk, it died. And I think we saw a lot of that on both sides. Bills that came out of the House or Senate that died in the other chamber. I think, again, some of those that probably would have been a little more extreme than I think most Coloradans are ready for.
Right. And the reason it's such a big deal this year is we're not talking about the state House. The Democrats hold a 7-seat advantage in the state House. They're not expected to lose that. They may even pick some seats back up in the House this year. And the governor's mansion could go either way. But let's remember, having John Hickenlooper in there, even if he had that full Democratic Senate, he would veto bills that a lot of people in the party would back. Jared Polis, not as likely to do that. He's, though Hickenlooper says he's going to govern from the middle, he's certainly known as being a more liberal Democrat than Hickenlooper has been. That's why that state Senate those races are so important.
And then the leadership, right, coming out of that, because you see a lot of term limits taking its toll on leadership. Certainly our current speaker, Cassandra Duran, Senate President Kevin Grantham, they're termed out. Those are going to be open seats. So I think there are going to be some interesting battles for leadership, depending on who's in control.
Yes, yeah. I mean, and just for the real insiders listening, if the Republicans hold the Senate, you're likely to see Jerry Sonnenberg, senator from Sterling, be the Senate president. Democrats take it back over. You're likely to see Leroy Garcia, senator from Pueblo, to be the president of the Senate.
Yeah. Hey, real quick, because I know we're going to be out of time. We've only got a couple minutes. Any state initiatives that you're looking at and tracking? On 97, the oil gas, we were teasing a little bit about Greyhound and signatures and collectors leaving the state.
Yeah. For those who aren't the hardcore geeks of following this, like Jeff and I are, the Initiative 97 would push 2,500-foot setbacks from houses.
87% of the state oil and gas reserves off
87%
limit.
of the non-federal land.
Yeah.
I mean, once you talk about everything that's already off limits, you're looking at 98% of the state that can't be drilled. And they lost. One of their signature collecting firms pulled out and sent their signatures via Greyhound. It was quite some drama. That is going to be one that people are watching. The two transportation funding initiatives are going to be immense. The Denver Chamber of Commerce is pushing one through that would have a 0.62 cent sales tax hike to raise about $6 billion worth, sell $6 billion in bonds. Meanwhile, the Independence Institute is pushing one that would say the state has to set aside $350 million a year from its general fund. That would create enough for $3.5 billion in bonds that would only hit the state's major highway projects. Either or both could be on the ballot. That'll be huge. There's also going to be a sales tax hike on education that looks like it'll be on the ballot. Their signatures are in. They're being counted right
early.
now.
Surprising how quick those came.
They got those in early as well. And we're going to see a couple other initiatives here and there, but those are the really big ones that I think a lot of people are going to pay attention to.
I really appreciate the conversation we've had here today, gentlemen. And actually, I'm going to ask our audience to tune in tomorrow because we're going to have Chris Brown with Common Sense Policy Roundtable and Dan Haley from COGA talking with us about the new study that CSPR just put out on Colorado Initiative number 97.
Yeah, and its impact to the state and the GDP and the the detriment obviously to the state and our economy of what that could look like in that setback. So
it is going to be a very emotional issue on this ballot.
No doubt.
Absolutely. So tune in tomorrow at 4:05 to connect and collaborate. Find this podcast and more at cobrt.com/radio-podcasts. Like and subscribe our YouTube page while you're here. Thank you so much, gentlemen. It's been great.
Thanks, Ed.